Models can take into account only the kind of information that applies when history is a good guide to the present or the future. When things are different, like a major party candidate dropping out or assassination attempts and so on, models start to have certain weaknesses with regard to their forecasting capacity. So markets take into account novel sources of information. Anything that any trader considers relevant starts to get incorporated into the market price. There's no reason why models and markets should generally give you the same forecast. If you make apple pie with two totally different recipes with different ingredients, it would be astonishing if they tasted the same.
Markets don't require you to tie yourself down, or don't require those who are trading on them to be tied down to any particular vision. They give a summary report about the cumulative weight of the judgments that traders will have come to one way or the other, however they will have come to it. And we don't have to know what's going on in the trader's head. Models tie our hands. They force us to look through a particular frame.
Exactly.
And that frame could be wrong. Hello, everybody. This is Glenn Loury, and you've tuned into The Glenn Show. I teach at Brown University, where I'm a professor of economics. And I'm also John Paulson Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And I'm joined this week by Rajiv Sethi, who's professor of economics at Barnard College at Columbia University and an old and dear friend of mine. He's an expert on many things, including prediction markets. With the election coming, I thought it'd be fun to talk to him. But as I was saying to him before we turned the recorder on, I really just need a friend to talk to at this time. And Rajiv is someone I've known for decades, and we've collaborated on academic research. And we've taught together in Bogota, Colombia, for summer schools, and done many other things over the years. So it's very good to welcome you, Rajiv, my old friend, to the Glenn Show.
I'm delighted to be here, Glenn. Thanks for having me back.
How are you doing?
I am doing fine. I have been inundated by calls from reporters about what's going on the prediction markets, especially with regard to differences between the markets and the models with regard to their forecasts on the election. And I just got back from the FIRE conference in Boston. So, things have been a bit busy, but I'm doing fine. Thank you.
FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or something like that.
It's now a Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. It used to be education. Yeah, they kept the same acronym, but changed the meaning of it.
What was the conference?
They have an annual academic conference. So it's really people who are either working with their own data. They have a lot of data that's freely available to researchers. They have academic grants. So some of the presentations are by people who are using their own data. Others are people just, speaking about issues that are of interest to FIRE. So, for example, Eugene Volokh was there, and Eric Smith, whom you've had on your blog before, Diane Mutz, the political scientist at Penn, and various other people. It's really an academic conference. A lot of philosophers, some folks at think tanks, but mostly university faculty.
The main concern of FIRE is about freedom of expression.
That's exactly right. So it used to be more narrowly focused on higher education and education more generally, but now they've got a legislative arm, and they take on cases of people whose speech has been suppressed, regardless of political ideology. I see them as having really replaced the ACLU. There's a wonderful article by Lara Bazelon from a couple of years ago in The Atlantic, where I think it's called "The ACLU Has Lost Its Way." And there was a time when the ACLU was viewed as a sort of nonpartisan defender of free speech, even for the most obnoxious and distressing speech. And I think that's the space that FIRE now fills.
I see. Did the case of Amy Wax get any attention?
Not explicitly at this conference. There were other cases. I think they've just recently had a victory at the Supreme Court regarding a case of a journalist from Uvalde, Texas. And a few other cases came up. But the conference was not really centered on their legal work. This particular conference is for academics. And Roland Fryer, your former student and mentee and collaborator, was a keynote speaker. Actually, it was more of a Q&A, but he mentioned you a couple of times, not surprisingly.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. Yeah. I'm not surprising, you say.
No.
Well, I'm curious now. Yeah, Roland is someone I've known since he was a graduate student. In fact, I served on his dissertation committee at Penn State way back 20, 25 years ago.
Right.
What was his brief, Roland? The technical, empirical economist who's made a big splash with his studies of a number of different issues in education and law enforcement and so on. But
that's right.
Speaking on free speech, that's as far as I know, that's a new territory for him.
Well, it was more of a Q&A session. He's describing really how Harvard's treatment of him, his suspension, the effect it had on him. And he's back now. He talked about walking into a class and he wasn't sure what to expect. And there are 200 students who broke out into raucous applause. And, he was very moved by that. And the context in which he brought up his interaction with you is that, his lab, he got into trouble. This is his perspective because he was relatively unfiltered. He didn't try to police conversations between people. He didn't feel it was his place to make sure that things remained within certain boundaries. And as an example, he mentioned...
Excuse me, I want people to know that he was accused of creating a hostile environment in response to some complaints from female members of his staff based on the kind of banter and back and forth that conversation went on amongst his subordinates and between him and the people working in the lab. And he was suspended without pay for 2 years from Harvard University as discipline for that, and became kind of a case on which people had varied opinions in the context of a kind of Me Too type environment. So he's back, and to learn that he was greeted by 200 applauding students coming into the classroom it's great news to me, and it must have been a tremendous boost for him as well.
I think,
I didn't know that everyone would know his case, so excuse me.
No. That's a very valuable background. And also, this has come through in interviews he's done with others. But when he's asked about what toll this suspension took on him, he basically said it's annoying, but growing up without a mother is difficult. This is in comparison. is just annoying. But he has said he will never do, or he certainly does not do any research now on Harvard's campus. So he's actively involved with research, but he'll do it. He'll do it off campus now, and he admits to not really understanding his role as a supervisor of a lab in ensuring that the environment was suitable for work for everybody, and the context in which he brought you up, and also brought up people like Gary Becker and Stephen Levitt. He mentioned, for example, going for walks in the woods in New Hampshire with you. He mentioned Steve Levitt calling him at 5 a.m., asking him what some hip hop song was, who was the artist and so on. And these are sort of situations of extreme familiarity, if you like. There are people who might look at this and say that this crosses some boundaries. And he was just trying to say that, look, this was the water in which he swam, right? He actually appreciated and welcomed these kinds of things that some might see as transgressions. Imagine a professor calling a student or a junior colleague at 5 a.m. asking about music or taking them for a walk in desolate woods. Some might see it as crossing a certain boundary, but he welcomed it. I think he benefited from it, and so he didn't see himself as having a role in policing boundaries in that way. But he doesn't claim that justifies anything. He's just a very resilient person. He's been through so much in his life. It's these kind of things is not going to bother him. There was a session on think tanks at the conference where very interesting because Wallach is now at the Hoover Institution. He's emeritus at UCLA School of Law. Eric Smith left his academic job, a tenured academic job.
This is Eugene Volokh. You want to tell people who he is who may not know?
Yeah, he's a well-known legal scholar. He was at the UCLA, on the faculty of the UCLA Law School, now emeritus, and he has moved to the Hoover Institution.
And a big blogger, doesn't his...
Big blogger, the Wallach Conspiracy. And they have published some very important documents. So I don't know, this may be going too far into the weeds, but there was a controversy about an art historian at Hamline University a while back who had shown a painting of the Prophet Muhammad created by Muslims, Sunni Muslims, in fact, which is considered by some to be Islamophilic, but was treated in that situation as Islamophobic. The professor was not renewed, and the chair of the religion department wrote a letter that was taken. That was initially published, but then taken down by the student newspaper, and Bullock published that. So both Hamlin and Erica is the first name, but I forget the last name of the instructor, the art historian. She was also at the Fire conference. Mark Bergman, I hope I got the name right, was also at last year's Fire conference, which I also attended. So he spoke about that incident. So I only mentioned this because of the Bullock connection. So he's published. So Bullock will publish. He's has a sort of libertarian bent, and he's certainly a free speech absolutist, is my understanding. So he will publish things that others won't publish, including this case.
I see.
Yeah, sorry if that went off on a bit of a tangent.
Now, I'm interested. You say Roland Fryer is no longer doing research at the university, although he's still active in his research. What does that mean? I can't, as a sitting professor, to be doing research seems to be almost by definition to be doing it at the university, if you're not on the campus when you do it.
I think that what he meant was he's not doing it on campus, on the premises. That he's offsite when it comes to research. That was my understanding. He's involved in research with corporations with regard to hiring practices. He's still doing some work on policing, sort of real-time feedback on trying to see whether or not stops and searches are discriminatory based on Becker's outcome test, and providing real-time feedback to agencies and so on. So he's doing work. He's doing work with corporations. He's doing work with departments, and it's just my impression is that he's not doing anything on campus with regard to that, except for teaching.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, intimacy. I mean, that's kind of the word that came to mind when you were describing
exactly
the kind of relationship that he and I enjoyed during his student and early postgraduate days. We took long walks. We shared, our thoughts unguardedly.
That's right.
We joked, and there was banter, and it was a kind of a bonding experience through which whatever it is I had to impart of benefit to him could be received, and so on. And that's a good thing, I think. Although I think when you get male-female interactions involved in that kind of environment with those kinds of relationships, people can misunderstand it. People can become offended. You don't know exactly where you may have in a casual comment crossed the line, something like that. And
so his point was that although he really appreciated the attention that you gave to him, the conversations and so on, it's not as if he was in a position to turn them down. That was the point.
It's not as if what? I didn't hear.
It's not as if he was in a position to turn these overtures down. That was the point he was trying to make, is that, it was, in some sense, he was compelled to go along with it. Of course, he was happy to do so, but somebody else may not have been. That's the kind of point he was trying to make.
I see.
If I understood.
Right. Did you make a presentation at the conference?
I did not. I just went there as an observer. I've been to one previous Fire conference and thought it was extremely interesting, and this was good. There was even a session on conservative overreach. So, there have been a lot of criticisms of activism on campus in the Ivy League and so on, but there have also been extraordinary suppression of speech, book bans, and so on in some red states, and Fire has been defending people who've been on the receiving end of that. So Fire really is, to me, it's really where the ACLU used to be.
Yeah. Well, I've been enduring some controversy myself, as you may have noticed. I had something good to say about Ta-Nehisi Coates, and apparently that's not acceptable in many quarters. And in fact, it wouldn't have been acceptable to me 5 years ago when I thought Ta-Nehisi Coates was off on the wrong track with his analysis of the racial problem in contemporary American society.
Yeah, I've been seeing the comments there. There's there's a great deal of hostility in your comments. I imagine you've lost a lot of subscribers and accusations of anti-Semitism and all kinds of things that are really quite hostile. I've been seeing that, and actually, I thought since I knew we were having a conversation today, I thought I should read the book. And I have gotten to that chapter on Israel-Palestine. I read the rest of it, but I didn't start the last chapter because I didn't have time to finish it. I thought, let me read it in one sitting. So I haven't actually read that, but I'd like to mention, if I could, a piece that Coates wrote in 2010 in The Atlantic called "The Ghost of Bobby Lee," and based on the conversations I've seen him have, for example, with Ezra Klein and also with the CBS news interview, the one that caused a bit of a stir. I see glimpses in that piece from 2010 in The Atlantic of his position that makes me feel as if I somehow understand where he's coming from, and that's an extraordinary article. He talks about the claim that Robert E. Lee was personally opposed to slavery, and he dispels that. He provides evidence to say that no, that was absolutely not the case. But then he finishes that with this remarkable reflection on intellectual ancestry, and he talks about. I have.
The piece is called "The Ghost of Bobby Lee."
Yeah, it's called "The Ghost of Bobby Lee," and I highly recommend it. And there are people who think that maybe Coates has changed. It's a very universalist, humanistic view of intellectual life. And if you don't mind, I have it right here. I can quote from it. He says there's a question of how we claim ancestors, a question that is more philosophical than biological. Africa and African America means something to me because I claim it as such, but I claim much more. I claim Fitzgerald, whatever he thought of me, because I see myself in Gatsby. I claim Steinbeck because whether he likes it or not, I'm an Okie. I claim Blake because London, is referring to the poem, feels like the hood to me. And I claim them right along Lucille Clifton, James Baldwin, and Ralph Wiley, who had it so right when he parried Saul Bellow. That's an interesting exchange to talk about. The dead and the work they leave, the good and the bad, is the work of humanity, and thus says something of us all. And in that manner, I must be humble and claim some of Lee, Jackson, and Forrest. What might I have been in another skin, in another country, in another time?
That's Andrew Jackson, and I forget the Forrest guy's first name.
I think it would be Lee, Jackson, and Forrest, meaning Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Nathan Bedford.
The generals, the Confederate generals.
And then Nathan Bedford Forrest. Yes, these are people, who... It's incredible for him to imagine himself, that he cannot rule out the possibility that were he born in their skin, in their time, that he would have done as they did. And, that's an interesting...
What's the point that you want us to take away from this universality of the challenges and pitfalls and snares of the human condition?
So I think the point is actually best made by his reference to the exchange between Saul Bellow and Ralph Wiley. So this is described in Ralph Wiley's book, Dark Witness, and he responds to Saul Bellow's question, who is the Tolstoy of the Zulus? So Wiley says, Saul Bellow is asking, who is the Tolstoy of the Zulus, as if there were no reply to this question. And Wiley's reply is, Tolstoy is the Tolstoy of the Zulus, unless you find profit in fencing off universal properties of mankind into exclusive tribal ownership. So
I think to quote Bellow, what he actually said was, show me the Tolstoy for Zulus and I will read him.
Yes, but that is right. That is right. So there are people who see that, but the usual interpretation of that is that there isn't one, that he was aware that there isn't one and that nobody would show him a Tolstoy of the Zulus. And Wiley's response is, well, why isn't Tolstoy the Tolstoy of the Zulus? Again, this sort of universalist perspective. And I think this is what he's bringing, because to the Israel-Palestine question. Now, I have to say, I haven't read his essay, but when he compares it to the death penalty. So we can move on to prediction markets if you like, but I just make one more point about death penalty. So he likens his position on Israel-Palestine to the position on the death penalty. I was very surprised to hear John McWhorter in your conversation with him basically accuse him of laziness, that he ought to be reading more, he should learn about the history of the conflict and so on and so forth. But I have seen, executions planned at prisons where you have, Christian groups standing outside with simple signs that simply say, "Thou shalt not kill." Right? It's just a belief and expression of a commandment that they believe is being violated by the practice of the death penalty. And you wouldn't ask them to go read about, studies that say that, the death penalty actually prevents murder or aggravated assault or rape. This is incidental. They're taking a position that has a lot of moral clarity, and they're not going to be convinced by academic studies of the implication of the death penalty on violent crime and so on and so forth. Similarly, one more example: if you have people in the pro-life movement, I suspect they're a minority, but who see, who think that life begins at conception and that an embryo that is created for IVF should have all the rights that you and I have as human beings, and they're opposed to the destruction of embryos. I mean, they would not be persuaded, by studies that say that, look at all the happiness that is brought to people by the practice of IVF, or the people able to have children and the effects on fertility and so on and so forth, the joy that it can bring to families, and the destruction of embryos is part of that. They would not be persuaded by that. So his position seems to be that you have apartheid, you have second-class citizenship in the West Bank, certainly, which is also, it seems to me, Benny Morris's position. And that's intolerable, no matter what the reasons, no matter what the national security implications. And you may agree or disagree with that. You may think that it's a moral stance that you don't share, as you would with regard to IVF or with regard to the death penalty. But that seems to me where he's coming from. And I mentioned this. I know we had scheduled this talk about the election and prediction markets, but I mentioned...
And we have time. We have plenty of time.
Yeah. But that's where I see him coming from. But I have to say, I haven't read that chapter yet. So I'll see. But that's the impression I get.
Well, I think if I'm going to be fair to John, I can summarize his position as Coates has a megaphone. When he speaks, many, many, many people listen.
Yeah.
There's a conflict, the outcome of which is existential from the Israeli point of view. When he speaks to it, he ought not to do so casually, emotively, flippantly, or in the abstract. When he speaks to it, he ought to do so rooted in an analysis of the history and the facts on the ground. How one interprets what one sees, whatever you call it, whether you call it apartheid or whatever, should depend not simply on how it reminds you of your own struggle or your people's own struggle, but it should depend on what you think the arc of history is bringing into being in this conflict.
Yeah.
So what he called apartheid, it was easy for him to say. It was a lazy, emotive reference. He ought to have rooted his conclusions in an analysis of the history and of the ongoing conflict. Implicitly, John is saying, were one to do so, one would be a lot less condemnatory of the practice of occupation in the territories. And Coates fails on that count. I think that's his argument. And it's animated by a sense of Coates's waving a bloody shirt of racism and so on in a historical context where it doesn't really accurately describe what's going on.
Fair enough. But I want to point out that the parts of his book that I have read also mentioned the way in which peasants in medieval Europe were referenced as unwashed, as stupid, as lazy, as that his position is not just about slavery in America. It's that whenever you have a system in which one group is in a subordinate position relative to the other, you get narratives that justify that based on the characteristics. And now, of course, most of his examples are about the US. That's what he knows best. But he does mention medieval Europe and the writings about the peasantry the unwashed masses, and he quotes from a historian with regard to that. So I think he's certainly best informed about the U.S. case. But I think his sense is that narratives emerge whenever you have these kind of asymmetries of power. And you have written about this. I mean, Orlando Patterson has written about narratives that emerge to justify slavery, that survived the abolition of slavery. That in your Anatomy of Racial Inequality, you have this extraordinary description of what racial dishonor means that I use if somebody says, okay, define racism. That's what I go to, which is, I think, so I'm doing this from memory. You may correct me or you may remember better, but you talk about an entrenched but inchoate perception of inferiority, intellectual incapacity, unfitness for intimacy, and so on.
That's practically a quote from a sentence in my...
Well, I've referenced it so
in
often.
my book, The Anatomy of Racial Inequality, where I have a chapter on racial stigma that tries to draw out this point that you're making about degradation. And
that's right.
It's what Patterson calls dishonor, radical dishonor, a lack of standing.
Yeah.
That is a concomitant of slavery wherever you see it over the ages. This is Patterson. But I draw on that.
You draw on that, and then you drew on it also in your books, your work on incarceration, right? About why people are not surprised or not distressed or taken aback by racial disparities in incarceration. If this is sort of a pre-analytical position that they bring to the conversation, and I think he recognizes this in the Middle East. Coates, of course, the words are yours, not Coates. So, well, I shouldn't say more because I haven't read the chapter, but I think there are issues to be discussed, and I think people are dismissive about the stance that you are taking. You may change your mind on it, but I think that you're having a very important conversation, Glenn. You started by talking about friendship, and frankly, of course, I can't think of anything that would come in the way of our friendship. But your conversations on this have actually deepened my respect and strengthened that friendship.
Well, thank you. I mean, let me just say, I didn't pick up Coates' book, The Message, intending to like it. I picked it up intending to be pissed off, intending to be dismissive, intending to be contemptuous, intending to be confirmed in my prior judgment that he's puffed up beyond his actual intellectual merit. He has a gift with words, no doubt, and that was clear enough in Between the World and Me, his bestseller. But a thinker, someone engaged with serious questions that I would want to take seriously. I picked up the book prepared not to give him that credit. And I put it down thinking, what an important voice.
Yeah.
And I did that not mainly, I mean, people will say you didn't like him when he was talking about race, but when he's talking about the Jews, it's okay to like him. And that's not it at all. It's more along the lines of what you're hinting at, which is his engagement with the challenges to our humanity that domination brings to the fore.
Yeah.
Both the dominators who have to justify what they do with their foot on your neck, but also the ones who struggle underneath the weight of that domination and who have to reckon with their resentments, their anger, their rage, their fury, which is a threat to their own humanity. And how those who have been victimized, can fall themselves into the position of becoming victimizers and feel justified in doing so because of their own victimization, that kind of thing. And I thought I was already intrigued when I was reading his account of his visit to Senegal.
Yeah.
And his grappling with identity questions in his relationship to Africa and Africans and the myths that he had assimilated about his own identity and crashing against the reality of the fact that, he's not really a Senegalese. He's not really an African, even though he carries this name and his father has imbued him with a certain sensibility as a radical Black nationalist growing up, his Coates' father.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is a man who's trying to think his way through some really interesting issues in our contemporary culture. And I also thought he's a writer. Quintessentially, he's a writer. Par excellence, he's a writer. He's a man committed to his craft, which is putting words on a page that move people. What he says, haunting. He wants the reader to be haunted by his words. He wants the reader, in reflecting on his engagement, Coates' engagement with fundamental questions of morality and conflict and identity and history, to come away from the page deeply moved and questioning. And I think he accomplishes that. And I think he has accomplished it even before we get to the long chapter in which he recounts his time on the West Bank.
Yeah, so I've read that chapter. I've read everything except for that last chapter, which I'm going to get to. But the Senegal chapter is very touching, very moving. And also the South Carolina visit. The chapter on the parent,
in South Carolina, where they want to ban his book.
They want to ban the book. And it turns out to be...
he actually goes to a meeting of the school people.
Board.
And finds much more support for his book amongst these conservative Christians in South Carolina than you might otherwise have imagined was possible.
Yeah, he's taken aback by that. That was nice. But the one thing that I was really struck by is how about his childhood notebooks. So the fact that he could have ended up in a very different place because he says people look at that and say that there are clear signs of ADHD. He was treated as somebody who wouldn't follow instructions, who was not, he described himself as a middling student and so on. But people who described him as intelligent, but just seemingly incapable of academic work in the normal setting. And
he never finished his degree at Howard University, and yet he loves it and cherishes his opportunity to return to the university as a professor.
So he this sort of fragility, of human life that a few lucky breaks can get you into a place where, I mean, you know this all too well. In fact, it's described in your memoir. You've got people in your own family, uncles and so on, absolute geniuses who ended up at the pinnacle of their profession and then, maybe took a fall. But, a few random fortuitous events, and maybe some errors of judgment, some mistakes, and, suddenly life just comes crashing down. And so this fragility also came across. But I haven't read the chapter that everybody's talking about. So I'll withhold judgment on that.
So let's talk about the election, Rajiv.
Yeah.
Everybody is on pins and needles now as the time winds down. We're a week and a couple of days away from D-Day.
Yeah.
What's your feeling about the lay of the land?
So, Glenn, I've been getting calls from journalists, several a week, and they're interested in this gap that has opened up between prediction markets and statistical models. So you have got basically two approaches to probabilistic forecasting of the election. You have statistical models like Nate Silver on Silver Bulletin, 538, The Economist has a model, and so on. Those are the three that I've been following closely. And then you've got prediction markets, Kalshi and Polymarket, which is crypto-based, and Predicted, which has been around for a while, which is much more restrictive in its rules of use. And the markets are generally giving, assigning a higher probability to a Trump victory than the models. So the models have it, basically they've converged to about 53 to 55% chance of a Trump victory. They see it as being a very close election. Markets are at about 60 to 65, maybe 10 points higher or 8 to 10 points higher in probability. And people are interested in the possibility.
I did not know that. That's astounding.
Is it though? Is it? I mean,
okay.
Because there are models and markets. The approach to forecasting is completely different. They're completely different forecasting mechanisms.
Let me just say why I think it's astounding.
Why?
Because of arbitrage. Because if I have a model and I believe it, and it has a prediction that's different from the pricing that's going on in the prediction markets, I think I see a profit opportunity.
Yeah. In fact, let me get to this point a bit. In fact, that approach, the arbitrage reasoning allows us a way of actually testing which is a better forecasting mechanism. So
forgive my interruption.
No,
getting there.
That's a very important point, which I hope we can get back to. Yeah. Now, arbitrage across markets brings markets into line with each other. So, if I can bet against Trump for, bet against Trump for, let's say, 40 cents for a contract that'll pay me $1 if he loses on one market, and I can bet against Harris for 55 on another market, I can buy $1 for 95 cents, right? That's pure arbitrage. I mean, I can make a risk-free profit, and I'd want to scale that up and buy millions and millions of contracts. So markets will get close to each other. Models don't have to. Models can disagree with each other because they can have different ways of weighting opinion polls versus fundamental data, economic conditions, and so on. But markets, they take into account all kinds of different information. So let me give you an example that directly addresses your point about arbitrage. On July 18th, which was 3 days before Biden dropped out of the race, all of the models were assigning zero probability to anyone other than Biden or Trump winning the presidency. So they had some models at 75% Trump, 25% Biden, and so on, but zero probability for anyone other than those two. Why? Because the models, the ingredients were opinion polls that were testing that particular race, and so they plugged them into their model. Models are based on the assumption that history is a good guide to the present and the future. They're calibrated based on historical data, and that was the only data available. So the models kept publishing until July 21, and they have zero probability for anyone winning the election, aside from Trump or Biden. Meanwhile, markets had Biden at 5% for winning the election. This is on July 18, and Harris at about 23%. Now, which one? Where's the opportunity for arbitrage? Well, there isn't one because nobody believed the model. Nobody believed that Harris has a 0% chance of election. Otherwise, you could bet against both Trump and Harris. So models can take into account only the kind of information that applies when history is a good guide to the present or the future. When things are different, like a major party candidate dropping out, or assassination attempts, and so on, models start to have certain weaknesses with regard to their forecasting capacity. So markets take into account novel sources of information. Anything that any trader considers relevant starts to get incorporated into the market price. And there's no reason why models and markets should generally give you the same forecast. If you make apple pie with two totally different recipes with different ingredients, it would be astonishing if they tasted the same. That's.
Let me see if I'm following.
Yeah.
Models require to be specified.
Yeah.
That is, you have to commit to a particular representation of what the causal process is.
Exactly.
The outcome of which you're attempting to estimate. Markets don't require you to tie yourself down, or don't require those who are trading on them to be tied down to any particular vision. They give a summary report about the cumulative weight of the judgments that traders will have come to,
exactly,
one way or the other, however they will have come to it. And we don't have to know what's going on in the trader's head.
Exactly.
Models tie our hands. They force us to look through a particular frame.
Exactly.
And that frame could be wrong.
That frame could be right under normal conditions and wrong under the present circumstances. So yes, models could be very useful in some situations and not so much in others. To take another example, for COVID prevalence, let's say, cases and hospitalizations and deaths, a model would be essentially epidemiological, right? They would look at infection, how a disease progresses. They look at the infection fatality rate and so on and so forth. Whereas a markets did not exist for this, but if a market could potentially react to a statement by Ron DeSantis to open the beaches, or a reaction by a school board to open the schools, and so on, which you wouldn't, which just would be missing data from the model. So models are different from markets, and we've talked about the strength of markets in taking on board information that models exclude. But markets also have weaknesses. Markets can have, well, you'll be familiar with Alan Greenspan's term, irrational exuberance. They could have excess volatility. They could respond to rumors. They could be dominated by a small set of traders who have very particular views. there are even incentives for manipulation of markets. And this is some of my work with David Rothschild on the 2012 election found fairly strong evidence that somebody was trying to trade in a way that put a floor on the price of the Romney contract, so that beliefs about his viability would not drop too far. Because elections are not like solar eclipses or Category 5 hurricanes. For eclipses or hurricanes, it doesn't matter what you believe about what's going to happen. It's just going to happen. Your beliefs are not going to affect the outcome. Elections are different. If a candidate starts to lose momentum, lose viability, you can have morale collapse among supporters. You can have volunteer effort dry up, and you can have donors walk away. And that can change the objective probability. So there are incentives actually in place to manipulate markets, to try to make your candidate look stronger than they actually are. And that might actually make them somewhat stronger. So markets are not perfect either. And the question about which is a more accurate forecasting mechanism on average is an empirical question. You can't reason yourself to an answer to that question.
Have you looked into the guts of the models? Do you know how they work?
I have to some degree. As they get closer and closer to the election, they rely almost exclusively on opinion polls. Far away from the election, they look at more fundamental data such as unemployment rates, the stock market, and so on. But at this point, they're basically reflecting opinion polls, and which is why they have basically converged. You've got hardly any difference between the three main models that I've been looking at. Now there are others that disagree, but the models have essentially converged to each other. So I do know,
giving a 53 to 55% chance to Trump prevailing over Harris in the election.
Correct. That is correct. And then they have predictions for every state, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina. So, and it's built up from that,
it would have to be given the Electoral College.
Exactly right. Of course, there are models, the models will predict who's going to win the popular vote. They give a probability to that as well, and so on. And various events like somebody sweeping all the 7 states. By the way, I think there's so much uncertainty in this election. I wouldn't be surprised if any one of the two candidates swept all 7. It's just very uncertain. But I'm not a forecaster. I just evaluate forecasting mechanisms.
But the traders' collective vision places Trump's chance of winning much higher than 53 to 55%.
Yeah, at the moment, across the 3 markets that I'm looking at, 60 to 65. And I want to say that it's not surprising that they disagree. It wouldn't be surprising if they placed it at 40 to 45. They're completely different forecasting mechanisms based on different information. The arbitrage argument works across markets, right? Within the set of markets.
Yes.
It doesn't really work with regard to model versus market, because the traders are, they're not constrained to simply use the model forecasts. They can go with all kinds of other information that they believe is relevant this cycle, may not have been relevant previously.
But I was thinking, and maybe it's wrong, if I were a modeler and I believed in my model and I saw a disparity between the price being at which contracts were being traded in a prediction market and what my model was predicting, I would expect my expected return would be positive from engaging in certain trades so this is the arbitrage point. Now I'd be taking a risk.
Yeah, you would be taking a risk. So it's not arbitrage in the classical sense of a risk-free portfolio. You'd be taking a risk, but people would be happy to take a risk to take the opposite side of that bet if they thought that your model was wrong. Sometimes the market price, so for example, suppose that the market price is 62, which is what it was last I checked on Kalshi. 62 means that you can buy a contract for 62 cents. That will pay off $1 if Trump wins and nothing otherwise. And so that's the structure of the contract. It's sometimes called a binary option. Some people interpret that as saying that traders believe that there's a 62% chance of Trump victory. That's not at all. That's not at all what's going on. There are traders who believe that there's a 70 or 75 or 80% chance of victory. And there are other traders who believe there's a 40 or 50% chance of victory. And they have so why aren't the 40% buying up at 60? Selling at 62? Why aren't the 75 people, snapping up these contracts?
Yes,
it's because they've already done so. They've got millions already, in their portfolios. They've hit their risk limits, or they've hit their budget constraints. So they've already bought to the point where they can't buy any more, either because they don't want to take more risk, or because they just don't have any more money. So what the market is showing is, in a sense, a balance between narratives of the election. There are those who think that the market price is too high, and they would sell the contract. Those who think it's too low, and they would buy the contract. But they are sitting there in balance because nobody wants to take now more positions in the absence of new information. When new information arrives, they'll change their mind. So that's my interpretation of the market price. It's a sort of a delicate balance between those who disagree one way and those who disagree the other, having hit their risk limits and budget constraints.
Now, listening to you makes me think that says many traders are not on the margin; they're maxed out, or they're up against a constraint. Because if they were on the margin, it would have to be true that their price and their probability would have to come into alignment with one another.
Not necessarily. That would only be true if they were risk neutral. If they were risk averse, they can afford to buy. They can afford to buy, but they've got, they're already shouldering a lot of risk. If they buy more contracts, they can increase their expected return, but that would come at the cost of greater risk. So that could be the boundary on which they are constrained. And if new information arises, they might well be willing to take on more risk. Or they might sell their position and go, reduce the exposure.
Are there deep-pocketed traders with huge positions in these prediction markets?
This is the point. This is why I've been getting so many calls from the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, New York Times, and Wired. I mean, this is the point. There are, especially on Polymarket. Polymarket is a crypto-based exchange, and they don't have a know your client requirement, which means that the exchange itself doesn't know who the traders are. They're trading, based on crypto wallets. Now, they're formally prohibited from allowing U.S. nationals to trade. Previously, that was circumvented by using VPNs. People who, from the point of view of the exchange, might appear to be in a different country.
Yeah.
And they've started to clamp down on that now for the large traders with VPN detection. And so traders have to either find somebody that they can work with overseas, or they have to physically move overseas to execute their trades. And there are people doing that. I know that some of the largest traders, and one of the most profitable and the largest trader on Polymarket has previously been on Predicted, Kalshi. There's no question that, in my mind, that this is a U.S. national. So I think that but I think that Polymarket is permitted to accept trades from this person as long as they're actually offshore, physically offshore. Now, the large trader effect. This is why I've been getting calls. So you had a group of four accounts on Polymarket that somebody linked to each other. They suspected belonged to the same person. Each one of these accounts had millions of contracts purchases betting on Trump. And the way that they linked these accounts together was the way in which the crypto wallets were being funded. The exchange on which the exchange of US dollars for the stable coin, the USDC, was undertaken was very similar. The amounts were similar, $500,000 at a time or $1 million at a time, and so on. So somebody on social media, actually this trader that I was referencing, in fact, linked these accounts together and said, look, this is the same person. And Polymarket has now confirmed that that's the case. It was the same person operating 4 accounts. And together they have maybe now approaching 50 million. I think is it 50? Yeah, I think approaching 50 million contracts in Trump. So they've put about $30 million into it. And
the fear is that they're trying to bump up the price of a Trump share in order to create a mood of positivity toward Trump's election, which would help him because people will be more likely to vote for him if they think he's more likely to win. That's a question.
One. Yes, exactly. So that's one of the possible motivations that people have considered. And so then that raised the question of, well, who is this person,
Yeah.
And somebody managed to get into a chat with them. Again, this trader that I mentioned before on Discord. And managed to find out, look, it could be all of this is cheap talk, Glenn, but it appears that this is a French national who was a trader in New York from 2000 to 2006, and based on some the way in which he uses grammar, some particularly French ways of speaking English or writing English does appear to be the case. And since Polymarket is closed, formally speaking, to US nationals, it makes sense that it would be a foreign national. Now, in that case, and the trader claimed that he just thinks that the price is too low. He thinks there's a 75% chance of a Trump victory, so wants to, he's got the money, he wants to bet. So you can't, based on the trading pattern, the trading behavior, it's not easy to tell what the motive is. In this case, it could just be maybe the simplest explanation, the most obvious explanation is the correct one. It's just somebody who's taking a price view, somebody who's making a bet that they think is worthwhile based on the price of the contracts in the market. That's certainly one possibility. Manipulation, I mean, this person claims they don't care about the outcome, of the US election. So again, if one takes it at face value, that's not what's going on. But certainly some of the press coverage has speculated on the possibility. Now, there could be others who are trying to push the price up a few points. Certainly in earlier elections, in the 2012, my work with the David Rothschild found a better to have lost $7 million betting on Romney. And the pattern of trade suggested to me that it was an attempt to affect the price and a willingness to take a loss. I mean, think about the cost of a presidential campaign. It's in the billions now, right? Yeah. The cost of a Super Bowl ad, I mean, even 30, 40 million, it's really small. Yeah. And if you can change the price, give a narrative of momentum, it becomes worthwhile. I'm not saying that's happening in this case, but people are curious about it. In 2012, what I noticed at around 3:30 p.m. on election day was that the order book for Romney contracts on this market that no longer exists in trade was very asymmetric. I put this out on Twitter, actually, and it was picked up by Justin Wolfers and then Chris Hayes, and so people saw it. But it was a huge number of contracts, offers to buy Romney at 30, and then at 29.9, and then at 29.8. Tens of thousands, not tens of thousands, but up to 10,000 contracts at a time. That was the limit in trade. And then if you looked at the other side, for selling Romney, it was much thinner, 50, 300, 25, there was an asymmetry. There were people who had placed orders to buy huge amounts and just left them there for people to take, which effectively set a floor on the price of the Romney contract at 30. And this was 3:30 on election day. Information is coming in thick and fast. Exit polls could leak. Some credible source might say that, look, Obama's going to win Florida or Ohio or both, which in fact he ended up doing. And in that situation, you'd lose a ton of money. People will trade against you. This is what, of course, you are familiar with as adverse selection, right? If information arrives that's detrimental to your position, then people will trade against you. If it doesn't, they won't trade against you. So conditional on trade against you, the information is bad for you. Why would you leave these contracts up here? Why would you make yourself vulnerable to adverse selection in this way? Well, maybe you don't care about losing. Maybe you just want to manipulate the price. Now, what's amazing to me is that this French trader in these 4 accounts have been doing exactly the same thing. Large limit orders in the book and basically setting a floor on the price and basically saying to the rest of the market, you want to sell Trump? I'll buy. Yeah. Come on, come on. And so then there's their activity. That's the interesting thing about the crypto-based markets is that everything's on the blockchain. Everything's public. In one sense, it's very private because nobody knows who they are. In another sense, it's very public because every transaction is public on the blockchain. And so you get this long series, hundreds of trades. And the counterparty to that trade, the buyer of the Trump contract, is the exact same person. And so is it what happened in 2012? Maybe not, because it's not election day. Maybe you're not so worried about adverse selection at this stage. I don't know, but I've been getting a lot of calls on this. There's a chance I might be on CNBC, midnight to 5 a.m. on election day, looking at the markets. One last thing I'll say, if you give me a minute,
please go ahead.
One last thing I'll say, which I think is fascinating. So Kalshi's market is not about who wins the election based on state reports, media reports, and so on in November or even December. Kalshi's market is on who is inaugurated. Who is inaugurated on January 20th. And if you get calls from the media and you get even state legislatures certifying the election, and there's a mismatch between that and the price, based on who's going to get inaugurated,
Oh my God.
people are going to be very concerned and very interested. So markets have
Meaning
become...
somebody is trading on the thought that the apparent outcome of the election will not be ratified with inauguration.
This happened in 2020. The markets kept open till December. And despite everybody basically saying that Biden had won, the likelihood of Trump being reelected, so to speak, operating unpredicted through contracts like, will Mike Pompeo be Secretary of State in February, for example? If you're betting on that event, you know that Biden's not going to be inaugurated.
Right.
And this was double-digit probabilities that Trump would be reelected. This is December 2020, a month after the election. And my interpretation of this is that it was an early warning signal of January 6th, or of the attempt to get Mike Pence to reject the submissions from the states. Markets have become salient now in a way that is irreversible. The crypto-based markets are out of the reach of U.S. regulators. Essentially, certainly the UK-based markets like Betfair, they're out of reach of U.S. regulators. So we are in a different world now, and it raises a whole bunch of issues that I've been writing about on my Substack and speaking to journalists about.
I want to ask you a question. Forgive me if it's a little personal.
Please.
You are of Indian extraction.
That's right.
And I've noticed in this election cycle the prominent presence of Indian or Indian American candidates. I've noticed Vivek Ramaswamy.
Oh, yes.
I've noticed Nikki Haley, and I've noticed Kamala Harris. In fact, am I not mistaken to say that your mother and Kamala Harris's mother were schoolmates back in India before they came to the United States to study, or to the UK, as the case may be?
That's right. They were in college together. They knew each other. But in those days, it's very interesting, Glenn. This is such an interesting thing to contemplate. If you were a woman in India at that time, really, and you were academically inclined, which my mother was, and which Kamala Harris's mother also was, really, there were only, the only path really open to you was to study what was then called home economics, to study catering management, food, nutrition, things like that, Or you could go and study overseas, or you could abandon the idea of higher education and or graduate study. And my mother took the first part, which was food and nutrition. She's published a few books on it. She has her own Substack, which I helped her set up, and she writes about home economics, basically.
She's still writing, your mother?
She's still writing. Yeah, she's still writing.
God bless her.
Yeah, I admire that so much. But she didn't go overseas. She probably would have wanted to study a different subject, but that was not open to her. Meanwhile, Shamala is Kamala Harris's mom, with the support of her parents, went overseas and studied, I think, molecular biology at Berkeley, and was able to enter fields that were not really open to her in India. And they took these divergent paths. But, in a sense, they could have traded places, or, I mean, who knows? It's a reflection of the conditions under which they were operating. They were both interested in higher, in graduate study. One stayed, one left. But of course, in those days, you lose touch, right? There's no email or anything like that. So they completely lost touch. But they were in school together. It's an interesting little fact I've written about on my Substack.
I wanted to ask whether or how you process the rising prominence of Indian Americans in American political scene, and are there lessons there, insights that about the nature of our society more broadly, its openness to people who are coming in from the outside, what the future 21st century landscape offers for us? Because these are not the last of their breed, I would imagine.
No, you didn't mention, J.D. Vance's wife, who's also...
I did not, but I'm aware of her. She would have been another example.
Yeah, exactly. And they're so different, though, Glenn. You look at Vivek Ramaswamy. Even Ramaswamy and Haley are quite different, in terms of their attitude towards foreign policy, just in terms of even basic character, I would say, or and of course, the two of them very different then from Harris. Yeah, your question about what does this portend for the future? Yeah, I think more of the same. In fact, more of you've had Andrew Yang run for president. You've had, of course, you've had Obama serve 2 terms already, and I mean, this is going back. Can we circle back to where we started?
Sure.
I'm a naturalized American. I'm very happy to be so. I waited a long time to become naturalized. I could have done it much earlier, but I did it at a time when I was psychologically ready. You have to give up I had to give up my Indian citizenship because India doesn't allow dual citizenship. And, I think that everybody knows what you have, I think, described as the unlovely history, of the 19th century Jim Crow period and so on.
Yeah.
Everybody knows that, but, the Declaration of Independence, the idea that it is self-evident that we are created equal, right? Originally, I think Thomas Jefferson had written sacred and undeniable, and Benjamin Franklin crossed it out and wrote self-evident. And
I never heard that.
I think that's one of the greatest editorial interventions in history, and that's my opinion. That it is self-evident.
Instead of grounding it in a theistic,
right. Instead of grounding it made it even more universal. That the undeniable is, of course, close to self-evident, but he just he just left it at that. Now it's beyond dispute. It's basically what you might call an axiom. In you discuss axioms in Anatomy of Racial Inequality, and basically the Declaration of Independence is saying that it is axiomatic that we are equal. They're beyond question. This is how we are going to build our society based on this axiom, so to speak. And of course, it's respected in the breach. We all know the history, right? But that is historically so unusual, right? The idea, especially if somebody growing up in India, I mean, my parents left when I was 11, but, the idea that there are people, going back to your quote from Anatomy, the idea that there are groups of people, about whom you have contempt, that this entrenched but inchoate presumption of inferiority, of unfitness for intimacy, of intellectual incapacity. This is the universal condition. This is where we are coming from historically, almost in every society that has existed. And then you get this, what seems to me to be a beacon of hope, right? And this, I think, is the thread that is being pulled by Coates. So going back to where we started, I think if you think it is self-evident that we are created and endowed with certain universal rights by our creator or through some other process, then having a system in which one group of people have lesser citizenship than another is just inconsistent with this axiom. And if you accept that, then countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like Pakistan, countries like Iran right now, they are by favoring a particular religion, particular ethnicity relative to others, are un-American. There's no reason why they should be American, of course, but there ought to be something unsettling about them from the perspective of this tradition in the U.S., which I love and which I embrace completely. So my interpretation, and again, I should say I haven't read that chapter. My interpretation of Coates is that this is the tradition within which he's operating. In which case, it's a conversation we really ought to be having.
Well, after you've read that chapter, why don't you and I have another conversation
Absolutely.
along these lines?
Absolutely.
You can pick it up from there.
Yeah.
I am reminded, since you are so fond of quoting me, of my axiom of anti-essentialism. I have axioms in my book.
Very important.
And my argument is that it's a political, moral presupposition that we will not repair to accounts of racial disparity that rest on the presumption of some intrinsic essential difference between the racial groups. We commit ourselves not as a scientific matter, not as an empirical matter, but as a principled ethical stance to the presumption of equality of the essential worth of the respective populations. And then we reason from there. And I've been criticized because, there's the racial realists out there who say, well, where's your data? Let's look at the genome. And I'm saying, as a political theorist, which I'm posing as in that part of the book, no, I say I want to build a society on the presumption that is not true.
And furthermore, to look for explanations for disparities. You and I have both worked, and sometimes work jointly, on trying to account for disparities, right? And one looks for explanations that don't violate the axiom, and they are available. It allows us to explore things in ways that we might not even bother to explore if we accepted essentialist differences across groups. It might be, okay, well, they're different, and so therefore you see these differences in incarceration or in wealth or so on and so forth, right? It opens up avenues of research that wouldn't otherwise arouse curiosity, frankly.
Yeah, there's a lot more to say here. I mean, the French are French, the Germans are German. They don't think that all cultures are equivalent to one another. They worry about the integrity of their heritage when they are confronted with immigration and so on. Why can't the Saudis be Saudi and the Pakistanis be Muslim or whatever, or the Israelis be Jewish?
Yes, I think that's fine. I just would rather live in a society that is built on different principles, such as ours.
Which is not the same thing as saying ours is morally superior, self-evidently so.
No, it's not saying that it is morally superior, but it is saying that if one accepts the principle on which it is founded, like I said, honored in the breach for much of American history.
Indeed.
But the principle is there in black and white. If one accepts that, then one will find unsettling, organizations elsewhere that appear to violate.
Okay, to be continued. Rajiv Sethi, Barnard College, predictions market guru, and dear friend of mine. Thanks for the conversation, Rajiv.
Oh, you're very welcome, Glenn. It's wonderful as always.